When Apollo left King Admetus and returned to the halls of Olympus, he had not rested there long before he found that there was further service for him to render on the earth. Among the many noted deeds that he performed, the most famous was his slaying of a monstrous serpent called the Python, which was born of the slime that remained on the surface of the earth after the deluge. Apollo killed the creature with his golden arrows, and then went to the help of Neptune, who, though a powerful deity in his own realm, was often obliged to ask help of the other gods when he wished to accomplish anything on land. Hearing that Neptune wished to build a great wall around the city of Troy, and remembering the aid that the sea god had given his mother Latona in her great need, Apollo went down to the sea and offered his services to Neptune. Of course, no son of Jupiter could be expected to do the work of a slave, but this was not necessary even in the building of a wall, for Apollo sat down on a grassy bank near by, and, with his lyre in his hand, began to play such exquisite music that the very stones were bewitched, and rising from the ground of their own accord, took their places in the wall. Still under the spell of Apollo's music, others followed in quick succession, and the wall rose higher and higher, until before nightfall the whole work was finished. When the last stone had dropped into place, Apollo stopped his playing and returned to the bright halls of Olympus, while Neptune, shaking the salt spray from his shaggy eyebrows, stared hard at the walls that had risen by magic before his wondering eyes. The story of Arachne's sad fate should have been warning enough to all mortals not to compare themselves with the gods, but such was the pride of a certain youth named Marsyas that he boasted openly of his skill in flute playing, and dared to proclaim himself the equal of Apollo. Now Marsyas had not always been a musician, for he was by birth a shepherd, some even say a satyr, and never had seen a flute or heard it played until one day, as he sat tending his flock on the bank of a stream, he heard sounds of music coming from some spot nearby. He was very curious to see who the musician might be, but he dared not move lest he startle the player and make the beautiful melody cease. So he sat still and waited, and presently there came floating down the stream a flute, something that Marsyas had never seen before. He hurriedly snatched it out of the water, and, no longer hearing the wonderful music, he guessed that it had come from the strange thing he held in his hand. He put the flute to his lips, and lo, the same sweet melody greeted his ears, for the flute was not a common thing such as any man might use. It was a beautiful instrument that belonged to no less a person than Minerva. The goddess had hidden herself on the bank of the stream and had been trying her skill as a flute player, but chancing to look down into the water, she saw her puffed out cheeks and distorted features, and angrily threw the flute into the stream. Thus it had come into Marsyas' possession, and the shepherd, having found such a treasure, never let it leave his hands. He neglected his work and left his flocks unguarded, while he spent all his days in the delight of flute playing. It was not long before he believed himself to be the greatest musician in all Greece, and then it was only a step further to declare that even Apollo could not equal him in the sweetness of his playing. The god of music allowed this boasting to go for some time unpunished, but at last he grew angry at the presumption of the shepherd boy, and summoned Marsyas to a contest in which the 9 muses were to be judges. Nothing daunted, Marsyas accepted the challenge, and on the morning when the contest took place, a great silence fell all over the earth, as if every living thing had stopped to listen. The playing of Marsyas was wonderfully sweet, and as the soft tones of his flute greeted the listeners' ears, they sat as if under a spell until the last sounds died away. Then Apollo took up his golden lyre, and when he struck the first chords, the air was filled with music far sweeter than any melody that had fallen from the lips of Marsyas. The judges, however, found it hard to give a verdict in favour of either musician. So a second time Marsyas began to play, and his music was so strangely wild and sweet that even Apollo listened in delight. But, charmed as he was by the youth's playing, the god of music had no intention of being outdone by a shepherd, so when he took up his golden lyre again, he began to sing, and added the wonder of his voice to the sweetness of his playing. When the singing ended, there was no longer any doubt to whom the victory belonged, and Marsyas was forced to admit his defeat. As the price of failure was to be the terrible penalty of being flayed alive, the wretched Marsyas had to submit to this cruel death. Apollo bound him to a tree and slew him with his own hands. When the news of Marsyas's dreadful fate spread abroad, people were careful for many years not to anger any of the deities by presuming to rival them, but in time the memory of that tragic event faded away, and the horror of it was forgotten. In the halls of King Midas was the noise of great mirth and feasting, and the sound of music filled the spacious room from where the king and his court sat at the banquet table. Beside the king stood Pan, his favourite flute player, who was no other than the famous sylvan god of shepherds. And as the wine went round and the king grew boastful of his possessions, he exclaimed loudly that not even Apollo himself could produce such exquisite music as fell from the flute of Pan. The guests, remembering the fate of Marsyas, grew pale and begged the king not to let his boast be heard, but Midas laughed scornfully, and raising his drinking cup above his head, called upon Apollo to appear. To the surprise and dismay of all, the god of music suddenly stood before them, beautiful as the dawn and glowing with divine wrath. Though Pan was himself a deity, he had no desire to challenge Apollo, and looked fearfully at the sun god's angry frown. But the king, drunk with pride, commanded him to play, and bade the god of music surpass the playing if he could. There was of course no question as to which was the better musician, and the guests loudly proclaimed Apollo the victor. One story tells that to prove further the superiority of Apollo's playing, the company went to the old mountain god Tmolus and let him make the final decision. Tmolus had to clear the trees from his ears to listen, and having done this he bent his head, and all his trees leaned with him. He heard with delight both musicians play, and when the last soft notes fell from Apollo's lyre, the mountain god awarded him the victory. But Midas, at the beginning of the contest, had demanded the right to decide on the merits of the players, and he would not accept this verdict. In his mad perversity and fondness for his favourite, he cried out that Pan was the better player, and would therefore be awarded the prize. Angered at this unfair decision, Apollo left the banquet hall, but not before he had assured Midas that the injustice would be punished. These words came true in a most unexpected way, for when the king looked into his mirror the next morning, he found a pair of large, fuzzy ass's ears growing in the place of his own natural ones. Horrified at this absurd appearance, Midas did not dare show himself to his people, but sent in haste for a barber and bade him make a wig large enough to cover the monstrous ears. For many hours the barber was closeted with the king, and when the wig was finished he was allowed to leave the palace, after having sworn never to reveal the king's misfortune under pain of death. For some time the secret was safely kept, but the poor barber found life unbearable, since he lived in constant fear of letting out the truth about the king's ears, in spite of his frantic efforts to be silent. Whenever Midas appeared in the city streets, the barber had to rush home and shut himself up, lest he should scream out the story of the wig. One day he thought of a happy solution of his difficulty, and one that broke his long seal of silence without endangering his life. He went out into the fields, dug a deep hole, and putting his head down as far as he could, he shouted, "King Midas has ass's ears! King Midas has ass's ears!" Then he went home again, much happier for having told someone of his secret, even though it was only Mother Earth. But the truth once told did not stay hidden even in the earth, for in time the hole was filled again, and reeds grew over the spot, and as the wind swayed them back and forth, they murmured, "King Midas has ass's ears! King Midas has ass's ears!" It was not long before all the people in the countryside had gathered to hear the strange whispering of the reeds, and then the secret could be kept no longer. But though everyone knew the truth, King Midas continued to wear his wig, and no one ever saw the real size of his ears. Like his father, Jupiter, the young Apollo was not content to stay always in the shining halls of Olympus, but spent many days wandering over the broad lands of Greece in search of adventure, or for the sake of some maiden's love. There were many fair ones among the daughters of men, and they were wont to look with favour upon the beautiful young god who came down from the high heavens to woo them. Each morning as he drove across the sky the fiery horses that were harnessed to the chariot of the sun, some maiden gazed with longing at the splendour above her, and prayed that the radiant Apollo might look kindly upon her. Seldom did these prayers go unanswered. But sometimes the heart of the god was untouched by the devotion so freely offered, and the maiden pined away over her hopeless love. Such a one was Clytie, who worshipped the glorious sun god, and longed in secret for his love. But in spite of her tears and sighing, she met with only coldness in return. Each day she rose before the dawn to greet Apollo as soon as his chariot appeared in the heavens, and all day long she watched him, until the last rays of light were lost behind the hills. But the young god felt no sympathy for her sorrow, and the unhappy Clytie grew so pale and sick with longing that Jupiter in pity changed her into a sunflower, that she might always stand watching the course of the sun, and turn her face forever toward him, no matter where his beams might shine. The great beauty of Apollo usually assured his success whenever he stooped from his high estate to love the maidens of the earth. But once he was repaid for his hard-heartedness to poor Clytie, and failed in his wooing when he sought the love of the beautiful wood-nymph Daphne. He was wandering one day in the forest when he came suddenly upon Daphne as she was gathering flowers, and her beauty and grace so charmed him that he desired her love above everything else in the world. Not wishing to frighten her, he stood still and softly spoke her name. When the nymph heard his voice, she turned quickly and looked at him with the startled eyes of some wild forest creature. Surprise and fear held her for a moment, while Apollo spoke again gently and begged her not to be afraid, for he was no hunter, nor even a rude shepherd. But Daphne only shrank away, fearful of his eagerness, and when Apollo grew bolder and ventured to draw near, she turned and fled through the forest. Angered at this rebuff, the god followed her, and though the nymph ran swiftly, she could not escape from her pursuer, who was now more than ever determined to win her. In and out among the trees she darted, hoping to bewilder him into giving up the chase, but Apollo kept close behind, and little by little gained on her flying feet. Wearied but unyielding, Daphne now hurried her steps toward the stream at the edge of the forest, where she knew that she would find her father, the river god Peneus. As she neared the stream, she cried aloud to him for help, and just as Apollo had reached her side and his outstretched hand was on her shoulder, a rough bark began to enclose her soft body in its protecting sheath. Green branches sprouted from the ends of her uplifted arms, and her floating hair became only waving leaves under the grasp of the god's eager fingers. Apollo stood dismayed at this transformation, and when he saw a laurel tree rooted in the spot where but a moment ago had stood a beautiful living maiden, he repented of his folly in having pursued her, and sat for many days beside the river, mourning her loss. Thus it was that the laurel became the favorite tree of Apollo, and when the god returned sadly to Olympus, he decreed that whenever poet or musician or any victor in the games was to be crowned with a garland of leaves, those leaves were to be taken from the laurel tree in memory of Daphne. In one of the flower-filled meadows of sunny Greece, there played all day a golden-haired boy named Phaeton, who was the pride and delight of his mother Clymene, a stately maiden whom Apollo had once wooed and won. The boy was wilful and headstrong, but beautiful as a young god, and his mother, in her foolish pride, often reminded him how favored he was above all other children in being the son of Apollo. Each morning she led him to a place where he could see the sun rise, and told him that his father was just then harnessing the fiery steeds to his golden-wheeled car, and would soon be leaving his palace of burnished gold to drive across the heavens, bringing daylight to the darkened earth. She told him of Apollo's great beauty, and of his wonderful music, and of his high position among the gods, because his chariot was nothing less than the glorious sun. Phaeton never tired of hearing these stories, and it was no wonder that he became very proud of his divine parentage, and boasted of it among his playmates. The children only laughed at his wonderful tales, and, to convince them, he grew more arrogant in his bearing, until they, angered by his continued boasts, bade him give some proof of his claims, or else be silent. This Phaeton could not do, so they taunted him with his godlike appearance, and sneered at his pretensions, until the boy, roused to action by their repeated insults, ran to his mother and begged her to tell him whether he might not speak to his wonderful but unknown father, and obtain from him some proof to silence the children's tongues. Clymene hesitated to send the child on the long necessary journey, but yielding at last to his entreaties, She showed him the way to his father's palace. It was night when Phaeton set out, and he was obliged to travel quickly if he wished to reach his journey's end before the sun car left the golden portals of the east. The palace of the sun was marvellously wrought, and the light from its golden columns and glittering jeweled towers so dazzled the eyes of Phaeton that he was afraid to draw near. But remembering the taunts of his playmates, he grew bolder, and sought out his father to beg the boon for which he had travelled so far and wearily. When Apollo, from his ivory throne, saw the boy approaching, he welcomed him kindly and called him by the name of Son. Hearing this, Phaeton lost all fear, and told his father how the children had refused to believe Clymene's story and had taunted him because he could not prove the truth of his mother's claim. The lofty brow of Apollo grew cloudy as he listened to Phaeton's words, and he promised to give the boy the proof he desired by granting him any favour he might ask. Instantly Phaeton demanded that he be allowed that very day to drive the sun chariot, for when those on the earth saw him in that exalted place, they could no longer refuse to believe that he was indeed the favoured child of Apollo. Dismayed at this unexpected request, the sun god sought to persuade Phaeton to ask some other boon, for he knew that no hand but his own could guide the four-winged horses that were harnessed to the golden sun car. But the boy was determined to carry out his plan, and with all the wilfulness of a conceited child, he refused to heed his father's warnings. As Apollo had sworn by the river Styx, the most terrible of all oaths, to grant Phaeton's request, whatever it might be, he was obliged to fulfill his promise, and very reluctantly he led the boy to the portals of the palace, where the impatient horses already stood, pawing the ground. Phaeton gazed at the sun car in delight, for it was all of gold, except the spokes of the wheel, which were silver, and the body of the chariot was studded with chrysolites and diamonds that reflected the sun's dazzling brightness. The impatient boy sprang into the chariot and seized the reins in his hands, while his father bound on his head the blazing sun rays. But before the journey was begun, Apollo poured over him a cooling essence, that his skin might not be shriveled by the burning heat of the sun, and gave him careful instructions how to handle the restless steeds. Phaeton but half listened to these words, and fretted to be off on his triumphant course, so Apollo ordered the gates to be thrown open, and the sun car dashed out into the heavens. For a while all went well, for the boy remembered his father's caution about using a whip on the fiery horses, but as the day wore on he became reckless, and forgot everything but his own proud triumph. Faster and faster he drove, flourishing his whip, and never heeding in what direction the maddened horses sped. Soon he lost his way, and the chariot came so close to the earth that its fierce heat dried up the rivers and scorched the ground and shriveled up all vegetation, even turning the natives in that part of the country brown, which colour they are still to this very day. Smoke rose up from the charred and blackened earth, and it so clouded the eyes of the now terrified Phaeton that he could not find his way back to the path of the sun, and drove wildly far away from the earth. This caused terrible disaster, for under the sudden cold all growing things withered, and the blight of frost settled all over the land. Then a great cry arose from the people of the earth when they saw their country laid waste, and though Jupiter was fast asleep on his golden couch, he heard the cry and started up in surprise. What could be happening on the earth, that the sound of human wailing should break in upon the silence of his dreams? One glance was sufficient for him to see the smoke rising from the burnt-up land, and to realize the cause of all that useless destruction, for far across the heavens, like a vanishing comet, Phaeton was madly driving the flaming chariot of the sun. Angered at the sight of a mere boy presuming to take upon himself so great a task, Jupiter seized one of his deadliest thunderbolts and hurled it at the unhappy youth, whose scorched body was immediately dashed from its lofty seat and sank into the calm waters of the Eridanus River. Clymene mourned her son's untimely death, and gathered his remains from the river, that they might have honourable burial. Phaeton's dearest friend, Sickness, continued to haunt the river's edge, looking for any relic of his favourite that might chance to rise to the surface of the water. In recognition of his devotion, the gods changed him into a swan that might stay for ever on the river, and plunge his head fearlessly into the clear waters to search for some scattered fragments of his unfortunate friend. During the childhood of Apollo and Diana, the goddess Latona lived happily on the island of Delos, and forgot all her early misfortunes in the joy of her children. As they grew up she boasted of their strength and beauty to all who came to the shores of Delos, and no village or hamlet, however small, but had heard of Latona's children. When Grecian mothers put their little ones to bed at night, they told wonderful tales of an island far out at sea, where a brother and sister lived who were fairer than all the flowers in the meadows, and maidens, sighing for a loveliness greater than their own, wove garlands to adorn the shrines of those two who walked the earth in all their immortal grace. Latona was proud of her children's fame, and boasted of it far and wide. Few mothers cared to dispute her claim, and these spoke only in whispers. But there was one, bolder than the rest, who openly laughed at the goddess's boast, and taunted her with having but 2 such children whom she could praise. This was Niobe, a Grecian princess, and the mother of 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, all of them fair and strong and godlike, in spite of their mortal birth. When Niobe learned that the people in her kingdom were loud in their praises of Latona's children, and were neglecting to honor her own splendid sons and daughters, she was very angry, and ordered all the statues of Apollo and Diana to be destroyed, for the people, in their devotion to beauty, had set up many in the temples and the marketplace. Then she bade a messenger go and tell the goddess what had been done, and show her in what contempt the mother of 14 children held her who had but 2. When Latona received the message, she was so enraged at the insult that her desire for revenge knew no bounds. She called Apollo and Diana to her side, and commanded them to go forth and slay the children of Niobe. It was easy for Apollo to accomplish his part of the cruel task, for he met the 7 sons of Niobe hunting, and slew them so quickly that not one of the brothers had time to ask what he had done to merit the god's wrath. The daughters of Niobe were in the palace with their mother, but this did not daunt the young Diana, who put 7 sharp arrows in her quiver, and, bow in hand, went forth to complete Latona's revenge. She found the maidens seated at Niobe's side weaving, and one by one the remorseless goddess shot them down, in spite of their mother's heartbroken cries for mercy. Finding that her entreaties were in vain, and seeing 6 of her daughters lying dead beside her, the distracted Niobe sought to shield the remaining one with her own body, while she prayed wildly to the gods to spare her this one child. But the gods were deaf to her cries, and Diana, fitting the last arrow to her bow, shot the maiden as she cowered in her mother's arms. Over her fallen body the wretched Niobe wept so long that the gods at last felt pity for her grief, and changed her into stone. This statue was placed by a running stream, and ever afterward the waters were fed by the tears that continued to course down the cheeks of the stone image, and travellers came from foreign lands to gaze on this marvel of a devoted mother who could not cease from mourning for her children even when turned to stone. Though the goddess Diana spent most of her daylight hours in hunting, it was not often that she exercised her skill to such cruel purpose as was shown in the case of poor Niobe. Wherever the wild deer roamed, and the pathless forest knew no touch of woodman's axe, there Diana, fleet-footed and tireless, followed the chase. As soon as the flaming chariot of the sun threw its first streak of light across the hills, the goddess donned her short tunic, and, armed with her golden bow and quiver, set out with her band of nymphs for the day's hunt. At noontide, wearied with the chase, she sought out some secluded spot where the mountain stream ran clear, and where the foliage hung round her like a curtain. On a certain day, when she and her maidens were enjoying the refreshing coolness of the water, they heard a slight rustle among the trees, and looking around perceived a young hunter watching them. This was Actaeon, who had himself been following the deer since daybreak, and had been drawn to this spot by the noise of running water. As he neared the stream he heard sounds of girlish laughter, and this so roused his curiosity that he hastily put aside the branches to see who the merrymakers might be. Great was his dismay when he recognized Diana and her nymphs, but before he could disappear among the bushes, the goddess saw him, and catching up some water in her hand, she threw it into his face, crying, "Go now if you can, and say that you have seen Diana at her bath." The moment these words were spoken, Actaeon felt a queer change come over him, and he stared in horror at his hands and feet, which were becoming hooves, and at his skin, which was rapidly changing into a deer's hide. Antlers grew out of his head. He dropped on all fours and found himself turned into a stag. Before he quite realized what had befallen him, he heard the baying of the hounds and knew that his only safety was in flight. He dashed off through the bushes, but the dogs were on his track. Before he had gone far the pack had overtaken him, since he knew no law of the wild things by which they elude their enemies, and were snapping and snarling at his throat. Deprived of his human voice, he could not cry for help, and in a moment the hounds had torn him into pieces. So was Diana avenged. There was another young hunter who encountered Diana and her maidens in the wood, but he met with a kinder fate at the hands of the goddess than did poor Actaeon, whose only fault had been a most natural curiosity. The fleet-footed Diana was no more ardent in the chase than was the hunter Orion, who roamed the forest all day with his faithful dog Sirius. One morning, as he rushed eagerly through the woods in pursuit of a deer, he came suddenly upon the 7 Pleiades, nymphs of Diana, who were resting after a long and arduous hunt begun at daybreak. Charmed with their beauty, Orion drew nearer, but the maidens, terrified at his outstretched arms, fled away through the forest. Undaunted by the remembrance of Actaeon's fate, the hunter pursued the flying nymphs, determined that so much beauty should not escape him. Seeing that he was gaining on them in spite of their swift feet, the maidens called upon Diana for help, and were at once changed into 7 white pigeons, which flew up into the heavens before Orion's astonished eyes. Some time later these same Pleiades became 7 bright stars, and were set as a constellation in the sky, where they have remained ever since. Orion continued to hunt from early dawn until nightfall, without any misfortune overtaking him on account of his impetuous love-making. On the contrary, his ardor evidently found favor with the goddess Diana, for one day when he unexpectedly met her alone in the forest, she smiled graciously upon him and offered to share the day's sport with him. Perhaps it was the beauty of the young hunter, as well as his boldness, that charmed the goddess, but however that may be, she continued to meet him in the forest, and they hunted together hour after hour until the twilight began to fall. Then Diana knew that she must leave her lover and mount her silver moon car. When Apollo learned of his sister's affection for the young hunter, he was very angry, for Diana had refused the love of the gods and had begged of Jupiter the right to live unwed. The sun god determined therefore to put an end to Orion's wooing, so he waited at the shadowy portals of the west until Diana, her nightly journey over, descended from her silver car and threw the reins on the necks of her wearied steeds. Then Apollo spoke to his sister of her hunting and praised her skill with the bow. Presently he pointed to a tiny speck that was rising and falling on the crest of the waves a long distance away, and bidding her use this as a target, he challenged her to prove her skill. Diana, suspecting no treachery, fitted an arrow into her bow and let it fly with unerring aim. Great was her distress when she learned what her brother's trickery had led her to do, for it was no floating log or bit of seaweed that her arrow had pierced, but the body of Orion. Apollo had seen the hunter go each morning to the ocean to bathe, and he thought this an easy way to dispose of the unworthy lover. Diana mourned Orion many days, and to keep his memory honored, she placed him and his faithful dog Sirius in the sky as constellations.